Welcome everybody here and all those people that are online, all the people in Philadelphia. Hi, how are you doing? My name is Ted Gong. I'm the Executive Director of the 1882 Foundation, and it is such a pleasure and honor to be here with Jennifer Lee and the Harris Institute of Public Law here at Georgetown University. I think that there is so much more that we can do, and this is going to be a start of I think, a wonderful series of events that we're having here, as well as in the future with some other things. So the 1882 Foundation is a educational program. 1882 comes from the 1882 immigration, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. That act prohibited Chinese from immigrating to the United States and from becoming American citizens. And what we do in the 1882 Foundation is promote public understanding of the awareness of the history of the 1882 Act, as well as the continuing significance of that act to everything that happens to all Americans. So we do that through policies that look at programs that look at oral histories and preservation of sites. So we do things like working at Summit Tunnel on the Transcontinental Railroad. We're trying to make that into a National Historic Monument or a landmark. And we also work on promoting best practices among public educators, museums, and historical societies. We also look at looking at curriculum and lesson plans, trying to work on standards of learning and lesson and those sort of things. So those three types of things we do. But one of the things that we are doing is actually collaborating with people such as Georgetown Law students and working with promoting awareness of the different things that have affected Chinese American experience. This is a great program for us. It's the first of what we hope to be a series of 3 lectures on Chinatowns, urban Chinatowns. So I'm looking forward to the presentation by the students here. The second presentation we're going to be having is with the American Site Landscape Architects. That's going to be on May 2nd. That would be looking at Chinatown futures, picking creatives and architects and looking at the Boston Chinatown, New York Chinatown, Chicago Chinatown. Third one that we're doing is probably going to be in June. That's with the DC Historical Preservation and Society, and that's going to be a return to the past. So we'll be looking at the DC context, the Chinatown, the historical development here. So, hey, this is a series of events. Please mark it on your calendar that there are others that are coming. What I'd like to do is introduce Jennifer Lee, and she's going to introduce the rest of the program. And Jennifer.
Thank you, Ted, and the 1882 Foundation for partnering with us on this fantastic event. As Ted said, my name is Jennifer Lee. I'm a staff attorney and adjunct professor here at the law school, where I teach in a policy clinic called the Harrison Institute for Public Law. My students, Justin Chuang, Eli Lee, and Claris Park, are part of a team that focuses on law and policy and equitable development here in Washington, DC and elsewhere, which is an issue I know is near and dear to many of us in this room. Georgetown's motto, law is but the means, justice is the end, is one of service. And in that spirit, we were so delighted to partner with not only the 1882 Foundation this year, but also with the Office of Councilmember Brooke Pinto, who, as many of you may know, is a proud alum of this school, and who just so happens to be the council member that oversees Ward 2 and parts of Chinatown here in Washington, DC. And as you'll hear from the students shortly, the council member reached out to us last summer asking for our recommendations and some of our help in providing strategies to help bring back DC Chinatown. So what you're about to hear today is a little bit of a preview of that research that the students have done over the course of the past 2 semesters in our policy clinic. Anyone who has walked from the Gallery Place metro stop, just a 10-minute walk from here to campus, knows about the condition of DC's Chinatown today. So today's conversation is not only timely, but for so many of us here in Georgetown and the Georgetown community, but also the DC community at large, it is a very personal issue for us. Over the past few months, we've had the privilege of meeting and speaking with so many community stakeholders across the country, not just in Chinatowns across the country, but also in Japantown and Little Italy. We're so glad that we've spoken to so many of you in this room today, as well as on Zoom. By my last count, there's 48 people Zooming in from across the country for this event. And they include Steve Nakajo from San Francisco's Japantown, Sojin Kim from the Smithsonian Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage, and Evelyn Eddie Moy from the Moy Family Association here in Washington, D.C. And there are so many more. So thank you for all of your conversations, without which our research would not have been possible. I also want to thank the Georgetown's Asian Pacific American Law Student Association, APALSA, and the Georgetown Clinic Program, including our faculty director, Bob Stumberg, and our assistant dean for clinics, Patrick Griffith, who've all been so supportive of the students' work this year. Before we get to that, though, I want to hand it over to Harry Leong, who's beaming into us from Philly. Harry, if you'll give a quick wave. And Harry, you there?
Yes, I am.
Harry is going to introduce us to Philadelphia Council Member Mark Squilla, who is our keynote speaker today. So over to you, Harry.
All right, thank you. So this evening, again, thank you for having us. Thank you, Georgetown Law School, for having us. I wanted to have the pleasure to introduce the councilman for the first district in Philadelphia, which is one of the more diverse and growing districts in the area. And again, this from his website, the council district runs from Delaware River to his native South Philadelphia, across Center City, Chinatown, Northern Liberties, Fishtown, Kensington, and Port Richmond. I've known Councilman Squilla for about since 2010, when he first ran for office within the city council, and I actually had the opportunity to sit with him one-on-one just prior to his office, him going into office. And from his background, he similar to my work in the community, he's helped to build community by coaching youth in his neighborhood, and also led the fight to save the Burke Playground in South Philadelphia. From there, his community organizing led to other opportunities to build community in the Whitman neighborhood, which later led to his election onto city council in 2011. So in these past 12 years, Councilman Squilla has been a consistent engagement. He consistently engaged with our community and his constituents. He's always willing to support, always willing to listen and talk, and as well as act when needed. He was also my shotgun when we drove to Washington, D.C. in September to visit DC Chinatown to see the effect of the Capital One Arena to the area. And so we had a really good opportunity to get to know each other. And so welcome, Councilman Squilla.
Harry, thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you to Georgetown for hosting this great event. You know, when we look at culture throughout the country and what it means to not only Philadelphia being the first World Heritage City, it's really important to be able to understand the importance of culture and how we make sure that we hold on to that as long as we can, and then put in place necessary either guidelines or legislation in order to make sure that is preserved. I represent part of the Chinatown community in Chinatown, and you know, it is a very vibrant part of our city of Philadelphia. It is a place that's visited, but also not only visited by outsiders. A lot of people live in that community, and living in that community and working in that community are so important to be able to try to preserve. As Harry told you, I did take a trip to DC with them, and we went and visited what's left of the Chinatown community in DC. And you know, I think the goal when we went there was to say, all right, there's always a lot of development and changes within communities, but what can be put in place, or what can we learn from what happened there to prevent it from happening in other areas throughout the country? I actually talked to a council member out in San Francisco who was very active in putting some strategic zoning criterias in to help try to hold on to Chinatown in the San Francisco area. So it's important for me to not only lead, but also to listen. When we went to DC and spoke about what it was before the arena went there and the subway station that was there and some other changes. And, can something be put in place to try to hold on to these great culture icons in the cities that we represent? Is it legislation that's needed? Is it policies? Is it federal policies, state or local policies that can help preserve them? As immigration continues to grow, can we continue the flow of immigration into those communities, and to see how to make those communities stay vibrant and have people not only to live there but work there and keep that cultural aspect of it. In Philadelphia, our Chinese community is growing, but not only in Chinatown, right? We have parts of South Philadelphia, parts of the Northeast that are growing tremendously. And how do we still, by doing that and by growing, how do we still keep that cultural icon of Chinatown still alive and vibrant as it is? So there's a lot of challenges out there with gentrification, with increase of property values and other things that lead to changes throughout communities. And I think the hard part is knowing what to do to protect them. And how do we as a city look to protect them? How do we work with our state and federal partners to look at those parts? And, knowing that we still want development, we still want open space, and we still want things that are better for the people in those communities. But how do they sometimes negatively impact the surrounding community? And, we want the neighborhoods to continue to get better and flourish and be safe. But we don't want to do that at the consequence of losing the cultural hub that we have. So I think having events like this, learning, listening, looking how other areas and what they have done to not reinvent the wheel every time you try to do something, and then be able to have a message that we could disseminate through not only the Chinatown communities, but other communities that we're trying to save along the way to make sure that cultural heritage stays part of that. So, there's a lot of challenges out there as a city, and I'm sure throughout the country and in other communities. But by having these types of conversations, I think it goes a long way to helping us understand them and then preserving them so that we could have these for the next generations to come, and knowing that we did the right thing. So I want to thank you for having me here. Thank you for hosting this great event, and looking forward to listening and learning as we move forward.
A round of applause for Councilmember Mark Squilla. Thank you so much, Councilmember, for joining us. And thank you for your continued work and advocacy in preserving cultural centers and especially Chinatown. So thank you again for your time.
Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Yilin Zhang. I'm honored to be moderating today's session. I'm with the 1882 Foundation. And as the council member just mentioned, conversations and listening, they're incredibly important. And in my work with the 1882 Foundation with Ted Gong and the team, that's basically what we do. We have these talk stories, which is the title for today's event. We talk and we listen and we learn from one another's stories. So I'm a longtime DC resident, did not grow up in Chinatown, but I have very fond memories of going to Chinatown. And to me, it's a symbol of family. It's not just a place. So I'm really excited to hear the research that the Georgetown team has been doing. It's been an incredible collaboration with them. So I'm not going to waste any time. I'm going to introduce, to my right, I have Justin Chuang, and to my left, I have Claris Park and Eli Lee, and they're going to take it away and show you the research that they've been working hard on.
I'm Justin, along with my teammates, Claris Park and Eli Lee. I'm a second-year law student here, and I'm also with the Harrison Institute. Everyone in this room probably has a visual or sensory association with Chinatown. When you hear the word Chinatown, you probably think of egg tarts. Someone throws stuck walking down the sidewalk. You might think about the Chinese vendors on the sidewalk that sell fresh fruits and vegetables that you can't get at the local grocery store, not even at Whole Foods. You might think of families that are in town for special occasions at the local banquet hall. You might think of elderly residents chatting it up on the sidewalk. And on that same sidewalk, you might think about tourists that are taking up way too much space. This is the picture of a very vibrant and thriving Chinatown with a very strong sense of place, identity, and purpose. However, the reality, as we've come to appreciate over the past few months, is very different. Last year, Councilmember Brooke Pinto reached out to us to help her understand the state of Chinatown, and also to provide recommendations for how to get DC Chinatown back on its feet. Our role as legal and policy advisors has been to connect with the community in a way that is open and is open to the people who live and work here for these recommendations. It's been a privilege to work with both a public official and community in this way. Our goal today is to share with you some preliminary findings from that research and help to set the stage for Jack and Harry, who will share firsthand experiences in DC and Philadelphia. Sorry about that.
It's because I made it lower because I'm much shorter than you.
So, and to set the stage for Jack and Harry, we're very honored to be sitting on both the physical and the virtual stage with the both of them because they've done so much work over the past years, and we continue to learn from their advocacy. When the team first began our research in September for the council member, we thought that our task would be relatively straightforward. Recommend strategies for vitalizing Chinatown and pull strategies from other jurisdictions to see how they were doing it. We thought that DC Chinatown was very unique in its challenges: disappearing storefronts, closing businesses, loss of foot traffic, shrinking residential base. These were all unique to DC Chinatown. But when we saw Philadelphia Chinatown's battle against the Sixers Arena, our entire perspective very much changed. Back in October, Jack and two other former Chinatown residents, Eddie Moy and Jack's brother Harry, not the Harry joining us virtually right now, published an open letter in the Philadelphia Inquirer that supported Philadelphia Chinatown's opposition to the 76ers arena. The letter reads like a cautionary tale. They write that we've already lived through what Philadelphia's Chinatown residents are facing now, referring to the construction of the Washington Convention Center and the Capitol One Arena, which displaced residents. After the publication of the letter, a delegation of Philly Chinatown stakeholders that you just heard about, including Councilmember Squilla, came down to DC to meet with the 1882 Foundation and tour what remains of DC Chinatown. As we've continued to speak to Chinatowns across America, we see that DC and Philadelphia's struggles are the struggles of many Chinatowns. There have been arenas, there have been convention centers, there have been jails, and there have been transit projects. Many other developments that have displaced residents and disrupted their networks. At the same time, there's so many factors that add on to and complicate the complex challenges that Chinatowns are facing. Our job has really been to try to sort through this and learn as much information as possible so that we can point out where things might be able to be done. This is what we'd like to share with you today. For the rest of our time, we're providing a very high-level overview of our research and setting the stage for Harry and Jack. First up are the shared challenges between DC, Philadelphia, and other Chinatowns. What are the commonalities? Next up are the research methodology and setting questions. What strategies do we use? What points do we focus on? Third are provisional findings and potential solutions. Given these challenges, what can be done? And finally, we'll close out with some final thoughts before passing the mic back to you. Throughout our research, and the conversations that we've had, we've come to learn something that seems very obvious on its face, that there's no one solution to Chinatown's problems. There's no magic wand that we can wave to fix any one of Chinatown's issues, let alone all of them. The solution will have to cut across many issues. It will be complex precisely because what Chinatown is facing is so complicated. In the next part of our presentation, Claris will talk about the problems that Chinatowns are facing and present some broader trends from our work.
Thank you, Justin. I will adjust for my height as well. But so when our team started our work this year, the first question that we had to ask ourselves was, what problems are Chinatowns facing today? And as Justin mentioned, we found that affinity communities share a lot of really similar challenges, and they tend to fall into two broad categories. We've been visualizing this as an iceberg, and with the very visible above the surface problems that maybe make the headlines that you see very often while walking through DC Chinatown, which you may be able to see, and we are only 2 blocks away from it today. These include displacement by arenas, as Justin mentioned, declining legacy businesses, and shrinking residential bases. Then you have the problems that are below the surface. They not only contribute to the more visible problems, but are systemic and intertwined. Of course, neighborhood residents, business owners, and stakeholders are not only aware of this issue, but very much feel them as well. But these problems don't always get the same kind of visibility or concern that a lot of other problems, the above the surface issues, get. These include general large-scale developments, which are visible but not as visible as arenas, changing immigration flows and suburbanization, a lack of shared community spaces, lack of crisis assistance, and lack of accessibility for available resources. Today, I'd like to focus on these below the surface issues because they are as impactful on the survival of many Chinatowns as the more visible ones. First, we know that the reason we're here today speaking with one another is because both DC and Philadelphia Chinatowns are struggling with the consequences of arenas and large developments. And as Justin mentioned, development comes in many different forms. Some, like the development of DC's Federal Triangle in 1929, explicitly forced people to leave their homes and neighborhoods without offering any desirable alternatives. Often, there is no consideration to how development can meet the needs of community members, whether through community benefits agreements, through set-asides, or other tools and incentives. Importantly, a lot of Chinatown stakeholders feel left out of these conversations, out of the negotiation phase, and they feel that they are not heard during this process. Displacement can also be done by other developments, like luxury apartments and office buildings. On the left, you can see the condo complex on 777 7th Street Northwest, right next to DC's Friendship Arch, where a 1-bedroom condo costs $425,000. On the right, there is a digital rendering of a recently proposed short-term rental apartment unit in Philadelphia's Chinatown, which, according to the CEO of the development company, is catering to a new class of professionals. The effect of developments like these might not be as sudden, but they can raise rents and slowly price residents out. Development can also take away space from Chinatown as well, by either building on land used by the community or like the Vine Street Expressway in Philadelphia's Chinatown, splitting the community in half and making it really difficult for residents to gain access to all the amenities and community spaces that they need. In doing so, the neighborhood may slowly but surely lose its cultural identity as well. Not only that, cultural identity may be adapted by developers, but sometimes in a strange or offensive way. This mural is, after the arch, one of the first things that visitors to Washington, D.C.'s Chinatown notice when they step off the metro. And yet, community members have pointed out to us that, one, it's inauthentic. It's not authentic to Chinatown, to Chinese culture, and it plays to a lot of different stereotypes. It uses a chop suey font. Chinatown is, for some reason, split into 2 words. The dragon itself is cartoonish and also, as some folks have pointed out, not a Chinese dragon. We also recently learned that in Manhattan, Chinatown, there has been a proposal for a late night club. The developers of this club have reached out to all block associations in the area except the one that represents Chinatown. That being said, the name of the club is Duck Club, and this is the logo that they're currently using, which for an establishment that doesn't serve roast duck, let alone any kind of food, and hasn't reached out to any Chinese constituents or Chinese neighbors, it seems culturally appropriative and pretty insensitive. Residents and community organizations have been very vocal about the fact that they find this logo to be very offensive, and that the logo reminds them of the many lynchings of Chinese laborers throughout the 19th century, and that this exploitation does not carry racist undertones, it deals in racist overtones. Additionally, Chinatown's cultural identity is also changing as a result of changing immigration flows and suburbanization. While there are still Chinese immigrants coming to the greater DC and Philadelphia areas, they're not necessarily coming to the Chinatowns at the urban cores. In DC, you see folks going to the suburbs in Maryland and Virginia instead, where it's more affordable and there are community amenities available to them like schools and grocery stores. This map from the Washington Post is oddly cheerful, even though it's showing a very concerning trend of displacement. But that being said, it tracks where a lot of the affinity communities and restaurants have moved to over the past couple of years, and shows that New Chinese is up north in Maryland. Similarly, in Philadelphia, Chinatown is a tiny blue dot on this map, but immigrants are going to Northeast Philly and the surrounding suburbs instead. Something else that might contribute to suburbanization, but is its own problem, is that affinity communities have little to no shared community spaces. We have heard a lot about how youth organizations, sports clubs, and lion dance teams have had to relocate to the suburbs because they don't have practice space in Chinatown. Our team had the opportunity and honor to participate in this year's DC Lunar New Year Parade, thanks to the 1882 Foundation. And we were able to witness firsthand just how much of a vibrant and important role that Washington's Chinese Youth Club's lion dance team played in Washington, DC's Chinatown. And yet, they're currently headquartered in Kensington, Maryland. There are also very few green spaces available. And when they are, they're not necessarily equipped to host people. In DC, Chinatown Park used to have benches, which were removed sometime in the last year. Without them, the park isn't very welcoming or convenient. Additionally, as you can see from these two pictures, which are supposedly both from August 2021, it does not seem to be consistently maintained. These spaces may seem optional, but a neighborhood can't be a community without these shared spaces. Furthermore, COVID-19 was both socially and economically a very difficult time for Chinatown stakeholders. Due to racism and xenophobia, Chinatown businesses faced a lot of economic pressure early on in the pandemic, much earlier than non-Chinese businesses. And while there are pandemic aid relief programs, very few acknowledge that Chinatown businesses were hit earlier and hit harder. Chinatown business owners and organizations have also had a really difficult time accessing these aid programs, and sometimes they were excluded from programs altogether. Unfortunately, COVID-19 wasn't the first time that Chinatown has been in the middle of social turmoil. We've also seen this following the 1968 riots near DC Chinatown, following the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and after 9/11 in Manhattan. After Hurricane Sandy hit lower Manhattan in 2012, everywhere below 14th Street, including Manhattan Chinatown, was without power for days. During that time, community organizations like CAB, the Committee Against Anti-Asian Violence, stepped up and became the main source of emergency relief, not local government or national organizations. And even when there is no economic or social crisis, it can be difficult for Chinatown stakeholders to gain access to available resources. When issues come up in the community, local government can often be the first people that you want to reach out to. But the work that city agencies do is not always visible. And as you can see from this organizational map of these agencies, it's not always easy to tell who is responsible for what. There are a lot of players on this list and a lot of potential helping hands. It can be extremely difficult for non-government constituents to figure out what form to fill out or whose door to knock on. So, to recap, the first part of our work this year was to take stock of the above the surface challenges and below the surface challenges posed by development, immigration and suburbanization, lack of community spaces, crisis assistance, and access to resources. From here, our next step was to try to understand the ways in which affinity communities have tried to solve these problems in the past. I'll turn it back over to Justin now to explain the method that we used to do this.
Before we get into our recommendations, we wanted to very briefly share some of our research process. We decided to focus on a few select Chinatowns and cultural enclaves across the country as case studies, from which we would draw best practices and some potential solutions. The blue dots you see here are, in totality, some of the cities with the largest Chinatowns across the country. For the purposes of our research, we narrowed it down to just the five you see here. San Francisco, DC, Philadelphia, Manhattan, and Boston. These others are very similar to DC in that their Chinatowns are all located in pretty dense urban centers. To understand the state of DC Chinatown and plan for the questions that we would ask in other jurisdictions, we first did a lot of local research. We looked at ordinances, agency plans, agency oversight hearings, and a lot of media coverage. Our outreach was also very much influenced by a lot of the interviews that we've done on the ground in other jurisdictions. We've spoken to community organizations, businesses, elected officials, and local agencies. This year, we've spoken to over 40 people in 7 different affinity communities, not just Chinatowns, but also Japantown in San Francisco and Little Italy in New York. In these interviews, we kept certain guiding questions in mind. First, what types of initiatives have been effective in Philadelphia and in other communities? What have our counterparts in other cities tried? Secondly, what types of initiatives are feasible and can actually be implemented? What types of considerations would these initiatives face? Finally, what are the existing initiatives that can be improved? How can we provide recommendations that best ensure that resources are getting to the people who need it most? From this research and our conversations around Chinatowns and other affinity communities across the country, we discovered some potential solutions that we might be able to recommend in Chinatown, which I'll turn over to Eli to discuss.
So let's talk about some potential solutions. As you can see, the shared problems of Chinatowns that Claris identified are both wide-ranging and complex. However, if local actors stay invested and engaged, there is reason for optimism. Throughout our interviews, we've taken note of the strategies and interventions that local community members, organizations, and governments have implemented in response to these challenges. For the purposes of our analysis, we've divided these interventions into 5 broadly defined categories, those being initiatives that increase access to affordable housing, public space interventions, support for local businesses, land use regulations and requirements, and active engagement from government officials and representatives. When we were practicing this presentation, I initially tried to present all 5 of these categories in detail, but to spare you all from the gripping 15-minute lecture that resulted from that, today I will only be talking about 2, those being public space and business support. We chose to highlight these areas because we think that they're both strongly relevant to the current situations in both DC and Philadelphia Chinatowns, and because we think that solutions in these areas are accessible and within reach of community members and governments in both of these cities. By highlighting some of the examples of strategies that have been enacted in these areas, we hope to show that both community members and governments have important roles to play in protecting and preserving Chinatowns. We also hope to highlight the interconnectedness of these problems, which will require multi-stakeholder coordination in order to tackle interrelated issues simultaneously. There is no one silver bullet, as much as we would like one. So, as Claris noted, safe and accessible public space is crucial for Chinatown's well-being. This issue is linked very closely to the flourishing of both local businesses and resident populations. Imagine that your Nai has moved into an affordable unit in Chinatown. It's great that she can live in the neighborhood, but when she leaves her building, does she feel safe and comfortable? Does she feel like she has the independence to walk down the street for groceries? Simply put, is it a Chinatown she would want to live in? Similarly, will families want to raise their children in Chinatown if the neighborhoods aren't lively, dynamic, and culturally authentic? Will visitors to Chinatown want to spend time there and patronize local businesses? This is an area where we think both private organizations and governments can play important roles, contribute to flourishing public spaces. As an example, in late 2019, the Philadelphia Chinatown Development Corporation opened the Crane Chinatown Community Center, a state-of-the-art neighborhood hub. Since then, the Crane has regularly hosted community events ranging from Tai Chi, vaccine clinics, and educational workshops to sports and youth programs, including, yes, lion dance practice, courtesy of the Philadelphia Suns. The building has also helped make Chinatown's identity and personality apparent to all. Just last week, DC officially designated a new 6,000 square foot mural on the side of the building, which was designed by Philadelphia-based AAPI artists, who interviewed Chinatown community members for inspiration. The mural pays tribute to the neighborhood's history by featuring a scroll that depicts 1991 protests against the Vine Street Expressway, and it draws patterns and motifs from East and Southeast Asian cultures. Visible for miles around, this mural proudly reclaims the space of the neighborhood and declares, "This is Chinatown." Public safety is another issue that can be addressed through public space-oriented initiatives. In Japan's San Francisco's Japantown, a network of security cameras was installed by the Japantown Community Benefit District, a local nonprofit funded by property assessments. These cameras cover 100% of the neighborhood's area and are monitored by the Community Benefit District, with recordings shared with law enforcement as needed. Many community members have responded warmly to this initiative. And night markets and street closures are another great way to make public spaces feel vibrant and safe. For the last 3 years in New York, the organization Think Chinatown has held a summer night market series, which has brought hundreds of visitors to Chinatown each month during the summers and highlighted local businesses. The poll has also found that around 85% of community members feel safer with the night market in the neighborhood. And these initiatives can really boost local economies as well. A recent New York City study found that weekend street closures in Manhattan's Koreatown, part of the city's Open Streets initiative, increased local taxable sales by around 15% during the pandemic, facing both the borough at large and parts of Koreatown not close to traffic. But night markets and street closures are no good without authentic Chinatown vendors and businesses front and center. Picture, for example, a DC pedestrian who happens upon a hypothetical Chinatown Open Streets event. With an empty stomach and a wallet full of cash to spend, this hungry customer passes through the Chinatown gate, rolls down a 7th Street strewn with colorful banners and paper lanterns, and enters the local Smoothie King. Now, I don't mean to be too harsh on the Smoothie King. I've been there more than a few times myself, and it's pretty great, but it is true that small businesses, often immigrant or family-owned, are the soul and the anchor of most Chinatowns, not large corporate chains. As a result, supporting these businesses is an imperative for local organizations and governments, both to preserve the character and identity of these neighborhoods, but also to serve the traditional needs of their residents. Succession planning and assistance with business modernization can really help these legacy businesses. In New York, the organization Welcome to Chinatown has helped many legacy businesses plan for succession to the next generation of ownership and management. They've also assisted with initiatives intended to market these businesses to broader contemporary clientele. This is a photograph from a recent tasting event they put on with WoHop, a longtime neighborhood staple in Manhattan, Chinatown, which featured custom merchandise commissioned just for the occasion. And yet again, this is an area where public policy can really supplement private initiatives. San Francisco's city government recently formalized the place of pride that legacy businesses have in their community by establishing an official directory of businesses over 30 years of age. Inclusion in this directory entitles businesses to promotion by the city, as well as to operating subsidies both for the businesses themselves and for the landlords who rent to them. And this has helped these businesses stay in place and continue to anchor their neighborhoods. As Justin mentioned at the beginning, this is really just a very small snapshot of our findings and suggestions. The low-hanging fruit of Chinatown adaptation and preservation. I'll now pass it back to Justin, who has some words of encouragement for us all.
So we'd like to leave you with 3 key takeaways. First, that knowledge and experience sharing across Chinatowns and different affinity communities is mutually beneficial. Creating a network of Chinatowns where community members can share strategies can enable us to strengthen our responses or strengthen Chinatown's responses to the challenges that all Chinatowns face. Relatedly, Chinatowns must build these networks because solutions will have to cut across many different issue areas. Tackling one category of issues, like public space, will not allow Chinatown to survive, much less thrive. Finally, collaboration between residents, community organizations, and governments is critical. Community members need to have access to their local policymakers who make the key decisions about which neighborhoods get critical resources, like grant funding for small businesses. Local policymakers also need to understand that Chinatowns, like every affinity community, are unique. Sustained engagement with the constituents that live in Chinatown, whether or not they speak fluent English, is essential. This final point, the collaboration between all groups, is very important. DC and other Chinatowns are on life support, so we want to leave you with a call to action. Our first call is to local government. Solutions to many of Chinatown's challenges, including large development and arenas, something that requires a buy-in from local government that understands and is willing to work with the local community. Local government has to take very intentional steps to do this. Walk the streets, speak to residents, hold listening sessions in their communities. Understand who might be potentially displaced, not just the people who live and work in Chinatown, but the many hundreds and thousands of Asian Americans in neighboring communities for whom Chinatown remains a cultural touchstone. For the many Chinatown stakeholders that we've spoken to the last few months, we would love to continue the conversation. We've invited people from Chinatowns and other affinity communities across the country to speak on a Chinatown-focused virtual panel on May 1st to kick off AAPI Heritage Month. We'd love to help expand the DC-Philadelphia partnership to include more Chinatown and affinity communities that are facing similar issues. Please be on the lookout for an email from us. Finally, thank you to the members of the media who are here today. We hope you'll continue to report on these conversations. Chinatown really needs continued coverage of the many challenges that it faces, not just in the aftermath of an instance of racial violence. Please continue to cover what's happening in Chinatowns across the United States, because what's happening in these neighborhoods is emblematic of a universal struggle that many affinity communities are facing right now, especially those that are primarily composed of people of color. We see that Washington, DC, the nation's capital, that's also known as Chocolate City, still struggles with massive rates of inequality, from housing to food access to education and public safety. Collaboration between all of these parties is necessary, and it's only the beginning, laying the groundwork for solidarity across all affinity communities to face those shared challenges. Thank you. But thanks for your time. I know we just about talked your ears off, and we're happy to answer any questions at the end. If you'd like to reach out to any of us, please don't hesitate to send us an email. Thanks again for listening. We'd like to pass the mic back to Yilin.
Thank you so much, Justin, Clarice, and Eli. Actually, another round of applause. That was a lot of work. And thank you to Jennifer Lee for leading the team. She's been tremendous to work with. Also, another round of applause. So I've just been very impressed with their research because they have really taken the time to speak with all different stakeholders across many different Chinatowns. And tonight's conversation, we are also really excited to have Jack Lee, who is to my left, and Harry Leong, who is on Zoom. And Jack is our representative for DC Chinatown. And I must admit, because actually I know Jack through his lovely wife, Penny Lee, who is in the back taking a lot of photographs. And she herself is an activist, and she did this wonderful documentary called 3 Chinatowns. So I highly recommend you look that up. But because I knew a lot about Penny, I had to do a little snooping on Jack. So this afternoon, I found like a 1-hour oral history with Jack, and he has a really tremendous background. I will let Jack introduce himself, but actually before I do that, just want to remind the folks who are on Zoom to feel free to introduce yourself, where you're coming from. And if you have any questions, please let Mia Owens, who's monitoring our Zoom, to know that you have a question. And after Jack speaks and Harry speaks, we will actually take some audience questions. So feel free to write down your questions on the index card. We will also have a mic that will be going around. So with Jack, without further ado, I'd love for you to speak about your background growing up in Chinatown, the work that you've been doing, your work with CCBA, the Chinese Consolidated Benevolence Association, and what you see for DC Chinatown.
Thank you, Yilin. And thank you to the 1882 Foundation, to the Georgetown University Law Center, and to the students that Justin said Chocolate City. I said, he can't be old enough to remember that. Too young. But anyway, so yes, I was born about 5 blocks north, and I lived about 4 blocks west of this area. I grew up on 6th Street, which was one of the residential streets of Chinatown. Chinatown back then was bounded by Furniture Row, if you're familiar with 7th Street. That was a plethora of Jewish, mostly furniture stores, but there were some others. To the west, to the east was the government accounting office, and to the south was the department stores. So we were caught in this little enclave of area. But if you know Chinese history, right, we're going to try to get wherever we can. You know, after the Federal Triangle thing, well, let's find another place. And we were lucky to find 8th Street. We had some help because back then we could not buy property, right? But there was a German Jewish resident who kind of brokered our first building. And from there, we were able to populate more and more. So when I came along in the 50s, believe it or not, Chinatown Hall had all the essential marks. It had the laundry, it had the restaurant, it had the grocery stores, and then following that, we had residents. And even though census might say 3,000 at its peak, really, it was a very vibrant neighborhood because we had kids, and I was one of those kids, right? Chinatown didn't have much to offer in terms of government services or things like that, but it had its own poor people, right? So many people may not know, right? We had our own credit union. We have a credit union that we had to create under the Lee Family Association. We had Chinese Consolidated Benevolence Association because, you know, when people came, we couldn't reach out to the district government. Most of them didn't even really care, probably. We had to fend for ourselves. There was no playground, right? As a kid, I played in the alley. I ran around the streets, I'll admit, right? But that's where we were. That's where we played. That's where our safe haven was. We enjoyed it. I didn't know any better. The only time I ventured out was to go to Seton Elementary, which is about 4 blocks north. I went to Jefferson Junior High down by the wharf, the new wharf in DC now. In high school, I went to Western, now known as Duke Ellington, right in Georgetown. There was nothing in Chinatown that was our normal, what I would say, government type sponsored things. You know, everything we did, we had to create, and then when we ventured outside. It was the hub, right? Even if you didn't live in Chinatown and you were of Chinese ethnicity, you came to Chinatown, especially on Saturday and Sunday, because that's where everything happened, right? That's where you came to shop. That's where you came to socialize. That's where you came to meet other family members that belong to the same clan, right? For those who know a little bit of the history, right? Taishan, which I always call Toisan, is where most of the early Chinese residents came from in DC. So once one came, another came, another came. Then following the 1960s, sweetheart, where we let the immigrants come in, then that's where we came. So there, where Chinatown finds its crux, right? Where do you go first? You don't go to Upper Northwest. You're not going to go to Southeast. You're going to go to Chinatown. And my father, bless his soul, was kind of an unofficial social worker. He had enough command of English where when a new resident came, they would come to see my father, and he would help them get a green card. He would help them go to Social Security. He would help them get the kids into school because we didn't have a DC government type effort, right? It just didn't exist back then. And maybe a little bit was distrust of government. I'm not sure, right? But, you know, easy to come to my father. He's very gregarious, very social, very welcoming person. Hopefully I'm like that. I'm not sure.
Yes, you are.
Okay. So, back then it was safe during the streets. And many people may not know this, but actually DC Chinatown was ranked in the top 10 Chinatowns of the United States at one time. But as I think it was Claris who said, we're an iceberg now. And we're an iceberg barely holding on. And, I thought about it for a while as I was speak here, and I said, and I thought about my wife's film. I'm going to plug it again, Tales of Chinatowns. City center Chinatowns often have not a good fate. In our research, we were in Providence, Baltimore, and Pittsburgh. All had Chinatowns. All may have a plaque now to represent it. They didn't have enough residents. They didn't have enough people to sustain them. And once, in the case of Providence Chinatown, once they decided that they wanted to get rid of the Chinese, they came up with this infrastructure project to widen the street. It's called Empire Street, if you know your history. And they decided just to widen the part where the Chinese people lived, where Chinatown was. And once they did that, people fled to other parts now. It doesn't exist anymore. We were just there last year. So city center Chinatowns are always going to have this fate. And now DC is facing that same fate, right? When they built the first convention center, it was like a bomb hit the residential area. The 9th Street side of Chinatown was where most of the residents live. And then the bomb hit the MCI Center, now known as Capital One. That was the south side of Chinatown. It didn't hit 8th Street, which was where was the main business part, but you were chipping away at where people live. And then the newest convention center hit the Mass Avenue side, and that just really devastated all of the residents. So now when people talk about Chinatown, all you hear about is the Wadlock House, right? That's where most of the seniors live. There have been some improvements with that. There have been some advocacy to help maintain that place as well as Museum Square. I think there's still litigation with that one, right? But that's where, if that could fall, that's a whole group of other Chinese residents that have to find another place to live. So, I love to say two things from my wife's film, right? One person in Boston said, Chinatowns are always shaped by development. And then another part, one of the past residents said it was like a bomb went off and Chinatown disappeared. Talking about DC Chinatown. So, they call it, I call it improvement development. But really, the changes of real life Chinese characters on the buildings that we used to have, right, that meant something, now has become what another person has called the Disneyfication of the facade of Chinatown. So, when I speak with Harry, and I don't want to take Harry's thing, when they came down and talked to us, I said, I see what's going to happen. It's happening in DC Chinatown. It happened in DC Chinatown. I just think the same thing's going to happen in Philadelphia.
Thank you, Jack. A round of applause for Jack. Yeah. Well, Jack, you're really a committed civil servant. You've worked in the federal government for many years, and you've been very involved in the community. Wherever I am in Chinatown, Jack is always there. Both you and Penny. But this is a natural transition to Harry's conversation, because originally when we were thinking about this event, I was connected to Harry over in Philadelphia, and what they're going through is this proposed development for the Sixers arena. So unfortunately, history sometimes repeats itself. So with DC Chinatown, as Jack mentioned, you had the Capital One arena and what happened in terms of the displacement of the community and community development and cultural center. So that's what led to that natural conversation with Harry. So I'd like to invite Harry. Harry, can you hear me? Okay, great. Harry, you also have a extensive background. You're very involved in Philadelphia with the Chinatown and also with the Philadelphia Suns. You're the executive director over there. It's a nonprofit organization doing a lot of community work in Philadelphia, Chinatown, and you're just involved in a lot of different organizations. So would love for you to speak with us about your background growing up in Chinatown, your work now, and what you're facing with the Sixers arena.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Again, I wanted to congratulate the 1882 Foundation as well as the Georgetown Law students for their hard work and just being able to bring this about. Really, I was caught myself being part of the audience and following everything, particularly really relate to what Jack was talking about. So just as he talked about the history and his experience in Washington, D.C., I can really relate to that in Philadelphia as well. My family is a second generation Toisanese, just like Jack, and 8 siblings, well, 7 siblings, and five were born in the United States in 6 years. 4 were born five were born in a matter of 6 years. So a lot of kids really quickly. Our family was sort of typical Chinese American. My father was a chef in a restaurant, and then he ended up opening up his own restaurant, and so the family became the workers for the restaurant. My mother was a homemaker, and she did a little bit of seamstress too. She was a seamstress as well. And so growing up in the restaurant, that again, 16-hour days for my parents, and Dad constantly telling me, don't ever go into that profession because that's you're committing an entire part of your life to this type of work. So I did heed his advice and did not go into the restaurant business. I grew up as part of the Chinese Christian Church and Center, and unlike DC, we actually do have a playground, and our church had a playground which I pretty much grew in and grew. I was a product of the outreach programs, and eventually I became the director. So I've been the director here for 21 years, 20 years. I'm entering my 21st in October, and basically I'm the outreach director. So I do outreach programs in the community. My focus is really on youth, mostly with youth, and a lot of language and educational programs as well as sports. I also am the president of the Philadelphia Suns, and which is the CYC of Philadelphia, the Chinese Youth Club of Philadelphia. I've grown up with the Chinese Youth Club in the sense of competing against them and eventually developing some really strong and good relationships. Very encouraged that we have this common bond. And I know it was mentioned, one of the things that was beneficial for us to be working together among Chinatowns across the United States. And I am still, and Jack is still involved in networks among the Chinatowns around the United States. In the I guess early 70s, we had a development in Chinatown was the set of I-676, which is again was pictured which was the expressway that cut Chinatown in half. Not in half, but it cut in through the area where Chinatown could develop. And more recently, there has been funding from the federal government to do a capping over the expressway, so that Chinatown could kind of they call it the Chinatown stitch. So they're stitching they're putting a cover over the expressway. So that's very exciting, and looking forward to that. But in the 70s, we protested the development of this expressway through Chinatown. In addition, we also protested were against the Philadelphia Phillies baseball stadium in the 2000s, and then there was a casino that was also considered, and then as well as there was a prison that was also something that was on our plate too as well. And then obviously we also have a convention center similar to Washington, D.C. Within Chinatown borders that actually took away a lot of homes in the area, displaced a number of people in the area. So we faced similar situations in these past 40 plus years of me being involved in the community and serving within the community. We've battled different projects, and right now we're my visit to Washington D.C. was actually the point where it's sealed in my heart that this arena that they're going to build in Chinatown is not going to be beneficial for our community. I haven't seen anything otherwise, any information or any data that really has shown that this arena will really benefit our community in the long run. I think there's promises of a community benefits agreement. There's promises of working within the community, but currently at this point, I'm still listening. Even though I don't see it, I haven't seen anything that would change my thinking otherwise. This 76ers arena is going to probably do what it did to the Capitol Arena did to Washington, D.C. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Harry. Round of applause for Harry. So I'd like to transition to the next portion of the program, which is audience Q&A. And since we have about 20 or so minutes, I would actually love to just go straight to audience questions. But before I do, as the questions are percolating, would love to know, raise your hand if you grew up in a Chinatown or have lived in a Chinatown. Okay. We got one in the audience, but possibly more on Zoom. Now, raise your hand if you have a fond memory of Chinatown, and that includes eating in a Chinatown restaurant. Okay, that's almost everyone. Good. So I have a question. I'm going to read off this first question because I think it's very pertinent to this conversation we just had. And then feel free to write down your question on an index card, but Mia will also have a mic. So if you just raise your hand in a little bit, okay, great. We'll have one question over there. We'll take that question. The first one is a comment and a question from Ben de Guzman, who is the director at the DC Mayor's Office for Asian and Pacific Islander Alliance. So I'm going to read off his comments and a twofold question. So he says, proud to serve on Mayor Bowser's cabinet, working with Georgetown Law School and Chinatown, working for DC's AAPI community. He would love to know more about how Chinatown advocates around the country are working together to share best practices. He says that we are working to build a network of local government agencies that center AAPI communities, and that includes folks like Romana Lee Akiyama in Philly. So his last question is, how can we support national efforts to coordinate support for Chinatowns around the country? So it's really, how do we support Chinatowns around the country? And then how do we gather and share best practices? I think I may throw it to the Georgetown team first. Would you want to take a stab, Justin or Clarice or Eli? Okay, great.
So kind of you guys hear me okay? Okay, kind of a multi-parter here. So this first question of how have Chinatown advocates around the country really connected? A place that we've really seen this is in affordable housing. A lot of affordable housing developers that are focused on Chinatown, DC, and some in New York, like Asian Americans for Equality, well, they have regular conferences in which they discuss potentially some strategies that can be universal to many Chinatowns. That's one place where we have seen a lot of this partnership. In terms of how we support Chinatowns and how we bring them together, the upcoming event that we are planning with the 1882 Foundation, where we are inviting many people from Chinatowns and affinity communities across the country, is one such opportunity. But apart from that, having more opportunities to connect at these national conversations, because there is a need for much more conversation in these spaces.
Great. And Jack, would you like to comment about just how can community members support Chinatown?
Well, what I think for DC is that in learning from We visited Boston and Chicago, Chinatowns, during the making of my wife's film. And two key things, I think. In Boston has a very well organized community development center, ACDC, Chinese Progressive Association, two community-based organizations that support housing and human rights in Boston. Their problem in Boston, right, is Tufts University. Tufts University is trying to encroach on their city center, Chinatown, right? So the CPA will help residents, and then the ACDC builds housing. And I think one benefactor that helps Boston is they had a banker, a gentleman that used to be a banker who came back into Boston's Chinatown and helped create those organizations. In Chicago, they originally were in a city center type Chinatown, and they relocated, I think it's the south side of Chicago. But what was key in their development, I think, is that they had a seat at the table. They had political clout. They had Yilin Lee, which Harry knows quite well, as part of the Chinese organizations. He was, I think they call him an alderman, which I think is equivalent to city council or something. I'm not quite familiar with that. But he was there, so he had a seat at the table. And that, to me, is very important. We had an advocate here in D.C., but unfortunately, she passed away about 4 or 5 years ago, Linda Lee. Great person, was always at the, D.C. City Council meetings, always advocated for Chinatown. But her unfortunate passing is no one's been able to pick up the torch after that.
Thank you, Jack. And I'm going to pass it to Harry to ask, how can community members support the Philadelphia Chinatown?
Yeah, let me go back. Actually, it was Jean Lee's daughter who's an alderman. She just got reelected. So yeah, in Chicago. Yeah, I think I'm aware that we have pretty good relationships. Our Philadelphia Chinatown Development Corporation has very good relationships with others. Actually, Romana Lee Akiyama was also part of the PCDC at one point. So just having, I think Jack pointed out that having the political clout and having a voice in the situation is very important. I think our voting within Asian communities has not been very strong. I think that we need to develop and have a stronger voice in our votes, and even having members of our communities involved in politics as well. I think that is key. I think that the aspect of keeping strong relationships with among and not just focus on our own communities. I wouldn't want to see just my work to be focused right on Philadelphia Chinatown, but I'd like to be involved in what's going on in New York City or in San Francisco or elsewhere. I think that there are organizations that are collaborating, but I think that is actually very important too as well.
Thanks, Harry. All right, we'll go to our audience question. And Mia has the mic.
Thank you, because I was just starting to write it down, but it was like too complicated.
We want to hear your voice. Would love to hear your voice.
I don't see how anybody can talk about DC, Chinatown, or anything else without bringing up Metro, and nobody said Metro. So I'm just going to say Metro, and it seems to me that Metro access has destroyed all kinds of communities all around DC, not just Chinatown, but if you think about the fact that Virginia Square and Clarendon in Virginia used to be heavily Vietnamese, and they're no longer Vietnamese at all. But areas that don't have metro access, and another example, and it's not Chinatown, but it's kind of like it. Years ago, the city paper talked about Rockville as China Burb. And there's also this whole area, the Eden Center, which is not metro accessible out in Virginia. It's very Vietnamese. Annandale is still very Korean, but a lot of Koreans have moved out to Chantilly. So anyway, what's the role of Metro in gentrification, raising land values all around station areas throughout the metro area. That's why I couldn't write it down.
Um, I think of Metro as underground. It did put a little hole in the ground, but I think what happened more with Metro is there was a project that was slated called the Far East Asian Center, or Far East Center, that sits where the condos that they mentioned, right? Unfortunately, that project failed. I don't know the reasons why, but it failed. So it became a big parking lot. And so it was just a matter of time before, the MCI Center came through. I don't know if I can answer your question totally, but I didn't see where Gallery Place hurt us in terms of at least residential businesses.
I can also speak a little bit to it. I think it's a really good point about Metro as this through line between pressured communities. Although I will note that even Eden Center out in Virginia recently faced development pressure from a rezoning proposal that brought the community out in force against it. So certain of these challenges are universal even to communities that don't have that one particular aspect. But it's absolutely something that we've heard from community members that the shift towards public transit can make it difficult for certain traditional occasions in Chinatown, like banquets, which often bring in people who traditionally would need to park for a few hours to enjoy all the many delicious foods. But I think there's also ways in which the Metro has indirectly helped solidify Chinatown's identity. The renaming of the Gallery Place Metro to Chinatown Gallery Place is actually one of the few official acknowledgments that DC has given to Chinatown in terms of placemaking or designation. So I guess it's a bit of a waffling answer, but there are things that can be done to make the Metro more friendly to the community that surrounds it. And also, I don't think that every single problem of Chinatown can necessarily be laid down at the feet of the Metro either. It's just part of the conversation.
Thanks, Eli. And we'll take more audience questions, but I'm going to read off a question that I have on Zoom. So raise your hand and then Mia will pass along the mic. So this question is actually directed to the Georgetown team, but I'm going to rephrase it a little bit for Jack and Harry. So the question to the Georgetown team is, during your research, did you find that there was an officially recognized individual or organization representing that Chinatown? And then for Jack and Harry, currently, is Chinatown represented by a person or organization, or is it really a lot of different organizations that work to preserve Chinatown? So I'll have the Georgetown folks go first.
So I think it depends on the Chinatown and it depends on the affinity community, of course. But we understand that in Philly Chinatown, PCDC, the Philadelphia Chinatown Development Corporation, that Harry sits on the board of, they are designated by the city as a registered community organization, which gives them a seat at the table for a lot of these development conversations. And our understanding is that when there are significant changes or development proposals that come up, PCDC gets a say on whether or not that project gets approved. And so in that manner, PCDC is an organization that is recognized by the city. We don't believe that there is a specific organization or individual that's recognized in DC Chinatown, but I think that is something that we'd have to go back into our notes and look through case by case and district by district as well.
Thank you. Jack, do you want to talk a little bit about how the DC Chinatown is made up?
So the Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Association is an umbrella organization of 30 groups. It kind of represents what goes on in Chinatown in general. There is a WCDC also in Chinatown, which has opened up adult daycare center. Thank you, dear. Adult daycare center and medical facility, which in the past hasn't been there. So that has been one of the bright spots that's happening. I think, though, when it comes to DC's Chinatown, it's the large corporations that have come in are just very, very strong, for lack of a better word. I don't know if they just are getting the good tax breaks, but I always thought that the DC government is looking at tax dollars, right? Revenue is the most important thing. You know, Washington has had a bad reputation, chocolate city, right? That's not a good moniker usually, murder capital and things like that. So I think that the government wanted more development, wanted, you know, more business dollars to come in. And it, unfortunately, it just happens to be in the Chinatown area where the land is just most, you know, most valuable. You know, and once again, we didn't have a seat at the table. It probably hurt us. I won't, you know, I'm not afraid to say that. What we can do, I'm not sure. I always bring this one question up. And I know, you know, everything in the United States is equal for all. But really, what would it hurt to have a certain area of the city designated for Chinatown? Is that, I mean, is that a problem? And I'm not talking about Upper Northwest. I'm just talking about the one block that still kind of exists, where there's family associations, there's the Chinese Community Church. There used to be this rundown, ragged hotel on 6th and I Street that became a drug haven for many, many, many years when I was growing up. Yeah, I don't know what it is now, but boy, you know, getting that kind of building, you know, would solidify that block. The 1882 foundation's right there. You know, I'm not asking for, you know, to give it to us, but boy, it would help preserve, I think, some parts of Chinatown.
Thanks, Jack. And Harry, can you tell us about the Philadelphia Chinatown dynamics?
Yeah, so as Clarice said, that PCDC, Philadelphia Chinatown Development Corporation, is recognized in the city in regard to anything urban renewal, any developments in the community, and we're grateful that there is a level of respect. Councilman Squilla has been a strong advocate for our community. I think that we have a good relationship with him, as well as we have a lot of just good relationships in the community that support our work in building and sustaining and preserving. I think the goal of PCDC is preserve, protect, and promote Chinatown as a viable business and residential community, and we've taken that strongly, and again, because the city does recognize us, that has been a big push for us as a community.
Thank you very much, Harry. And, you know, recently I was at an event yesterday for Emancipation Day, really tremendous day, and I do a lot of work on DC statehood. So just want to say we had a representative who actually wrote a book called Chocolate City, and it's a really fabulous book. So as Washingtonians, we're definitely proud to be a part of Chocolate City. And so I want to pass it to our audience member. Do we have a question? Wonderful.
Yeah, hi, I'm Mitchell Yam.
Was that part of your question?
No, I'm an intern with the 1882 Foundation and a high school senior, and I just kind of wanted to ask about like, so some might say that like the kind of Chinatown magic that used to exist was a result of the like harsh racial discrimination that Chinese Americans faced, their inability to kind of climb up the societal ladder in terms of like financial and social standing. And I just kind of want to ask, how might you like come to terms with the claim that it's going to be hard to kind of create the old Chinatown magic again in a strong residential community because it was such a product of racial discrimination faced by Chinese Americans in the 1900s, and given that many Chinese Americans are now thriving in the suburbs and in many other parts of the DMV because of their ability to rise in social status and class.
Well, here's my opinion on that. You know, when I was growing up, right, I was taught, you know, study hard, become a doctor or a lawyer, right, or something of that nature. You know, don't make waves, right? So, you know, for us, it's really just get here, survive, and hopefully make your life better, right? So my parents worked hard to make my life better. I work hard to make my kids' life better. I think what I'm seeing in the difference in Chinatown now is the people who are getting involved politically. Boston, right? Just elected the Asian American mayor, right? Nicole Lee in Chicago, she's an alderman now. I think we kind of lack that in this area. So we need that at least to push. Now, it wouldn't hurt if Bill Gates came here, and gave us a couple $1 billion to help revitalize Chinatown. But that's not going to happen.
Harry, do you have a comment? Okay, Ted?
No, I don't. No.
Ted?
As if you have to preserve Chinatown as in itself. And that's not the perspective that I think people ought to think about. Chinatown is part of downtown DC. And what is very timely right now is that downtown DC put forth its corridor study, right? And how they're going to create or revitalize all of downtown. And see, Chinatown is part of that. I don't think you can replicate Chinatown or revitalize Chinatown without making it understanding that it is part of the entire downtown district, which includes everything from Shakespeare Hotel, all this other stuff that's there. You have to look at that as a whole. The idea that Chinatown, you could restore Chinatown because you could bring in more residents is another fallacy. The people are not going to return to Chinatown or establish itself. Whatever the ethnic group is going to be, people are going to live in the suburb area. That doesn't invalidate the need to have a Chinatown, which is exactly what I think Justin mentioned, that it is a cultural destination for the people that live in the different parts, whether it's Rockville or other places like that, to come into Chinatown. You cannot have an event in Rockville parking in a mall there. You have a Chinese festival, a New Year festival, and after the festival is over, there's no sense that Chinatown, that area belongs to Chinatown. But if you come to Chinatown here, you'll always feel, there's a feeling that this place actually is part of Chinatown. It has a sense of cultural belonging, right? So what does that mean in other terms? Does the city want to continue to promote the chocolate city? Or they always, when they give out grants and so forth, one of the measurements of whether or not you qualify and whether the brand is good, how many DC residents did you impact? But the question could be how many people from the suburbs did you bring in? How many people did you create lanes or traffic that allows for people to come into the city? These are all positive things that you can do. If you put in a bike trail and you take out a lane and you remove parking spaces, then people can't. Then that affects the businesses. So I know many people know of Albert Liu, who created some of the archway and so forth, and he always said, and everybody laughed at him, says, the reason Chinatown is disappearing is because there are no parking spaces. You've taken away the parking spaces. How many times people have heard him in different conferences and people just sort of laugh at him a little bit. But it is true that without parking spaces, restaurants, banquet restaurants can't exist. So if you're talking about genuine businesses, you have the noodle place, you have the fusion food, you have the food Asian banquets, like a table where you have 10 people to celebrate day, the anniversary, the celebration of the person who is retiring. These things are 10 tables coming in and the kids run around. These things are because they allow the families to come in and share their experiences, right?
Well, speaking of banquets,
Yeah.
we do have food in the back. And I'm sorry to cut you off, Ted, but we do have a couple more questions I want to get addressed.
Okay, but I would
Yeah.
just want to make this one point. You think that the metro, you don't need the parking spaces but no family is going to drive my grandmother and my kids to a banquet in Chinatown, right? And they'll be to the suburbs. When have that banquet possibility, then you begin to undermine the culture that is that celebration.
Thank you so much, Ted. Did we have a hand raised over there? Yep. Okay.
Hi, my name is Karen. Thank you all so much for all your hard work and presentation. I really learned a lot today. I had a quick question about something that was in the middle of the presentation about the San Francisco, I think Japantown, and about the increase in surveillance there. I was wondering if that was a specific call from the community, whether it was a call that was represented by like community needs throughout the entire city, and if there were any potential ramifications from that increase in surveillance and also working alongside the police in that area.
Yeah, I can speak to this. We spoke with with several members of the Chinatown Community Benefit District, which administers these cameras, and they said that they've received mostly positive feedback from community members, but it's true that other members of the community have raised concerns about surveillance and privacy. I think one of the things that we tried to highlight in our suggestions is the idea that, as Ted just mentioned, Chinatown it's for the whole city, and we want to avoid solutions that are unnecessarily adversarial. So I think the answer that I can give is things like that. I think we would want to ask for community input that's very active in the process of installation planning, making sure that you actually are talking to those people who might oppose these things before installing them in, let's say, DC or Philadelphia. There has to have to be a conversation, and I think that conversation would include those concerns that you raised.
Thanks, Eli. And okay, any more audience questions? Okay, Richard?
In particular, your work with Councilmember Pinto. We have an eyesore in DC, Chinatown, and that eyesore is the homeless shelter, the handy shelter, right? And that has created a lot of community distrust in policing because it's non-existent. Okay, crime has gone up. All right, safety in the neighborhood is really poor, and nothing's being done. The question is, since you're representing the council member, the question is, would the city entertain selling or transferring that property to a community that will develop that, and it could be private and public, develop that piece of property into a mixed-use property where we have a cultural center or share center for the community and low-income housing above that. Would you entertain that proposal?
So our representation of the council member is fairly narrow. We're really providing advice and some consulting on these specific issues. So I don't think we can necessarily speak for the council member, but I do know that public safety is one of her major concerns. In her most recent budget letter to the mayor this March, she did ask for the MPD presence at the Asian Leadership Office, which I think is what you're referring to be returned to that space. It doesn't seem to be happening, but unfortunately, I don't think we can really say what the city's orientation towards those plans would be. Other than that, community center is definitely one of the things that we've seen and that we tried to highlight in the presentation. So in a vacuum, great idea. Hard to be more specific.
Another thing is that in the conversations that we've had and what we've learned, that we really heard that Chinatowns have to be open to many people, right? A lot of people that live in Chinatown have a right to be there. Going back to the point about Chocolate City as well, I can't speak for the council member, but for me personally, and I think for all of our team, we're proud to live in Chocolate City, right? And for Chinatown specifically, there's really a belief, and also in a lot of our conversations, that yes, indeed, people have a right to be in Chinatown.
Thank you. And I'm just going to wrap up with two quick questions. I do want to ask this as a former researcher. I know how important process is. So Georgetown team, how did you gather information and over what period of time?
So we gathered information in a lot of different ways. We did a lot of reading the news, pulling a lot of reports, pulling a lot of legislation as much as we could. We also, of course, interviewed over 40 people, which is where the bulk of our information, about what is on paper versus what was actually implemented in different cities and communities. The research started with Justin over the summer when he was a research assistant for the Harrison Institute. But I believe the bulk of our work has really only started since the end of September, early October. So it's only been about 6 months, 7 months.
Okay, great. Thank you. And last question, but everyone will stick around. So if you have a question and then somehow the emails won't be invisible anymore. You'll see the emails at the end. So you can get in touch with with the panelists. Last question is more of a takeaway. So I'll start with Harry now. Harry, what would you like our audience members to take away with them today, or an action that they could take? What is a lesson learned and an action? So Harry, go ahead.
I think the aspect of staying involved and not just trusting and just allowing things to happen. I think I mentioned a little bit about voting. I mentioned a little bit about politics. I mean that our Chinatowns across the nation have not necessarily been that active and involved. I think that we need to engage ourselves, not only politics, but just engage and encourage our young people to be involved in the community as well. I think as we age, as I age, I look at the next level, and these millennials are not really active, and they kind of lose focus. Sorry, I wouldn't say all, but I'm just saying generally. That's what I've seen. I guess that's my takeaway.
Wonderful. Thank you, Harry. And Jack Lee.
I agree with Harry. I'm part of another organization called the Chinese Youth Club that was organized because, there's no Boy Scouts, there was no Cub Scouts, there's no Girl Scouts back in the day. We created our own organization. And I'm so happy that Mitchell, who plays with our athletic team, is here because that's what we need. Like Harry, I'm no spring chicken anymore. I mean, I'll do what I can, but really, I want, Mitchell and even my sons, even if it's a small thing that they can do, that's more than what I can ask for.
Thank you, Jack. I'll go to Justin.
I think that the point about younger people really getting involved is it's really important. And just as at the close of the presentation, I think that one of the big things is that it takes a lot of people, not just young people, not just existing residents in Chinatown, but also government, media, right? This is something that requires a lot of buy-in from a lot of different teams. And so that's really what I want to emphasize.
Thanks, Justin. Clarice?
I think something that has been really valuable for the Harrison team this year has been the many people that we've been able to speak with and the many communities and organizations that we've been able to get really good information and really good solutions and learn from. And I think, right now it's this conversation between DC and Philadelphia Chinatowns. But I think as we go forward, it's really important to expand that conversation to these other Chinatowns in San Francisco, Manhattan, and Boston, of course, but also San Francisco, Japantown, Manhattan, Little Italy, and Manhattan, Koreatown too, because there are so many best practices that these affinity communities could be learning from each other. So I really hope that in the future, the one thing that we can take away from this is that we should all communicate further.
Thanks, Clarice. Eli?
Yeah, I second all of that, and I'll make a point as a millennial. In response to discussion of political involvement and wanting youth to be part of that, I think something really powerful and new among the younger generations of Asian Americans has been an identity that's not just your specific type of hyphenated American, it's being Asian. I'm Vietnamese, Claris is Korean, Justin is Chinese, and when we get together, it's kind of like the Asian Avengers somehow. But that's a really powerful thing, and Chinatown is also like that. Chinatown is also like that. Chinatown isn't just for Chinese people; it's somewhere all Asians can go for our shared cultural amenities and also just to feel like you fit in. The artists who designed the mural on the side of the Korean Community Center incorporated Southeast Asian motifs because they talked to Cambodians who didn't live in Chinatown but came there on weekends for groceries and to eat and to meet other Cambodians from all around Philadelphia. So I guess what I want to say is that if we want to grow the coalition, I mean, everybody's welcome to support Chinatown, but I think Asian American solidarity among my generation is really, really a growing force. And so hopefully that can be leveraged in this direction.
Thank you so much, Eli. A round of applause for our panelists. Awesome. Really insightful conversation. Thank you, Jack, Justin, Claris, Eli, and Harry for Zooming in, although you couldn't be here in person, but would love to have you in person here sometime. I want to make sure I say a few thank yous before we dig into the food and network. I want to thank the collaboration with Georgetown Law, specifically the Harrison Institute for Public Law with Professor Jennifer Lee. Thank you so much. Thank you to the 1882 Foundation, Ted Gong as our executive director, and want to shout out Mia Owens and Gabby who are here working with us. And please make sure you check out the banners in the back. They were recently exhibited at the Kennedy Center, so really proud of the work that they've been doing there. And want to thank Apalsa again for the donation for the refreshments, and China Boy who has some, I think they're not noodles, they're dumplings and chicken. So please feel free to taste in the back. And thank you again, Georgetown Law, for this space. It's been a tremendous collaboration. And thank you, most of all of you for coming. And thank you to people for tuning in virtually. Thank you so much.